Hi guys, today we're going to talk about the work of Gregor Mendel. So some key questions: where does an organism get its unique characteristics? How are different forms of a gene distributed to offspring? And vocabulary that you should define: genetics, fertilization, trait, hybrid, gene, allele, principle of dominance, segregation, and gamete. Make sure you look up the biology definition for these words. When you're taking notes, make a 2-column chart by drawing a line down the center of a sheet of paper. On the left side, write the main ideas in the lesson. Those would be things in bold. And then on the right side, note the details and examples that support each of those ideas. All right, so let's get into this. The experiments of Gregor Mendel. So, inheritance is passed from generation to generation. Heredity is a delivery of characteristics from parent to offspring, and genetics is a scientific study of heredity. And it's the key to understanding what makes each organism unique. So Gregor Mendel, he was this Austrian monk. He was born in 1822 in what is now the Czech Republic. He was a high school teacher, and he was in charge of the monastery garden. So in this simple garden, he was able to do the work that changed biology forever. So inheritance, you might think of things that, maybe we all hope that we'll have a rich relative that'll leave us lots of money one day for our inheritance. It's passed down to the next generation, right? And so we get traits that are passed down. And studying that is what we call genetics. So let's look at this next one here. So Mendel knew that the male part of each flower produces pollen. That is where the sperm is. And then the female part of the flower produces egg cells. And so he was able to do some experiments based on this knowledge. So peas are small and easy to grow. They're what we call a model system. And he was able to carry out in 1 or 2 growing seasons, which would have taken decades or centuries to observe in large animals. So during sexual reproduction in plants, male and female reproductive cells join in a process that we call fertilization to produce a new cell. In peas, this new cell develops into a tiny embryo encased within a seed. And so pea flowers are normally self-pollinating, which means that the sperm cell from the pollen fertilizes the egg cell from that same flower. And Mendel's monastery garden was full of true breeding pea plants, meaning that they would produce identical offspring to themselves. So tall plants would have tall offspring. Green seeds would have offspring with green seeds, right? They were actually homozygous for their traits. So they were either homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive, and for their traits. So a trait is a specific characteristic such as seed color, plant height, etc. So he decided to cross his stock plants and see what happened. And he prevented them from self-pollinating. So he did this by cutting away the pollen-bearing male parts of a flower. So he cut those away. And then he took the pollen and then he dusted the pollen from this plant onto the pollen or the female part of another plant. So this is called cross-pollination, and it results in a flower having 2 different parents. So he studied 7 traits that each had 2 different characteristics. So like color of seeds, they could be green or yellow. So the characteristic was seed color, and then we had 2 different variations, green or yellow. The offspring of the crosses between parents with different traits are called hybrids. So let's check out what he was able to discover. So for each trait he studied, to his surprise, all of the offspring had the characteristic of only one of its parents. So we've got a tall and a short plant, they're crossed, and then all of the offspring are tall. That's only one characteristic. And so it seemed that the other trait disappeared. And then he went on to cross some more and he realized that they didn't disappear. So he made two conclusions. First, the individual's characteristics are determined by factors that are passed from one parental generation to the next. Today we know that those factors that are passed from parent to offspring are genes. And then each trait he studied was controlled by a single gene that occurred in two varieties. So tall or short, yellow or green, round or wrinkled seeds. And these varieties or different forms of a gene are called alleles. You'll see that they label these the P generation. P is for parent. F1, first filial. Filial is son or daughter. So those are the offspring. And then the F2 generation would be the second filial generation. So you'll see that on different things. All right, so his conclusion. His first conclusion, again, biological inheritance is determined by factors that are passed from one generation to the next, right? We call those genes. Genes are coded for in our DNA. We're not talking about these kind of genes. It's also spelled differently. So these are the genes that we're talking about. All right. Whoops. Wrong one. There we go. So each of the traits that Mendel studied was controlled by one gene, so that made it simple. That had two versions for each trait. Different forms of a gene are called alleles. The second thing that he noticed is a principle of dominance. So dominant and recessive. This principle states that some alleles are dominant and others are recessive. So an organism with at least one dominant allele will exhibit that form of a trait. An organism with a recessive allele for a particular trait will exhibit that form only when the dominant allele for that trait is not present. So he determined that dominant allele, which one is dominant, by looking at the traits in the F1 generation, right? So if you cross a round and a wrinkled plant and you get a round seed, round must be dominant, right? Yellow crossed with green, you get yellow. Gray crossed with white, you get white. We've got these smooth and constricted pea pods. They could have different colors, position of their flower, axial or terminal, and then plant height. So here's a good example here. Dominant is not strong and recessive is not weak. A lot of people tend to think that. This only explains which one will be expressed. Okay, and also dominant is not necessarily the most common, and recessive is not necessarily rare. So when you go to the store and you buy peas, we eat green peas, right? We don't eat yellow peas unless you like specifically seek them out. But the most common form of peas that we can buy in the grocery store are green, and that's the recessive trait. So all that means is you're going to only show this trait. It's only going to be expressed or exhibited if you have two copies of it. Okay. Dominant, there's something in the code for DNA that is coding for a protein that is made or is blocked that allows that one to be expressed. Okay, so it's not strong and weak, it's not common and less common, it's just which one is expressed. And if you have one dominant allele, you're going to express that dominant trait. All right, so segregation on the F1 cross. So what happens here when he crossed the F1 generation? So now he's taking two of those first filial generation plants and he's crossing them, and their alleles segregate or separate from each other. They don't stick together. And so the allele for shortness had separated from the allele for tallness. So Mendel suggested that the alleles for tallness and shortness must have segregated from each other during the formation of sex cells or gametes. So these are the gametes. They have one copy of each allele, so there's one option that they can pass on. And then they fertilize with the gametes from the other plant. So we get this 3 tall to 1 short ratio in the F2, or the second filial generation. All right, so formation of gametes. These are different types of pollen seen under a microscope. So this is just showing here that allele for tall and short, they separate from each other when they're making those sex cells or gametes. So in the male plant, the sex cell would be pollen, and in the female, it would be an egg. All right, so here's some questions for you. Take a look and see how you do. Gametes are also known as, I'll have the answers at the end. The offspring of crosses between parents with different traits are called, feel free to pause if you need. In Mendel's pea plants, the male gametes are blank. In a cross of a true breeding tall plant with a true breeding short pea plant, the F1 generation consists of what? So these would be homozygous tall, homozygous short, so 2 tall genes, 2 short genes. What will all of the F1 generation plants be? Or half, or whatever. What's the answer? And then, if a particular form of a trait is always present when the allele controlling it is present, then the allele must be what? All right, how did you do? Feel free to pause, go back, look up the answers if you need to. All right, so Mendel used true breeding pea plants and cross-pollinated them. So he found a couple of conclusions here. He concluded that biological inheritance is determined by genes, and they are passed to the next generation. So those genes are passed to the next generation. He also found that some genes are dominant and some are recessive. And then alleles are different forms of a gene. Alleles segregate or separate from each other during gamete formation. All right, I hope this made sense. Thanks for being great. See you next time. Bye.